Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to the Sunday Forum on this Sunday, February the 21st, as we continue our series on faith, vocation, and economics. And let me introduce you to our speaker for today. His name is Chris Armstrong. He is a program fellow for faith, work, and economics at the Kern Family Foundation, a foundation with which Emmanuel has worked quite closely for numerous years. Before we hop over to the interview, let me just read some of his bio to set up this wonderful dialogue again about faith, vocation, and economics. Chris Armstrong, PhD, is an author, educator, academic, entrepreneur, and church historian who got his PhD at Duke and his MA at Gordon Conwell. Chris has served as program fellow at the Kern Family Foundation since March 2019. He taught from 2004 to 2013 at Bethel Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is where I first got to know Chris well. And there he founded and directed an initiative of faith, work, and economics that was entitled Work with Purpose. From 2014 to 2018, he served as faculty member and founding director of Opus, the Art of Work at Wheaton College, right outside of Chicago. Chris took up church history to learn how Christians have lived out their understandings of God, humanity, and the world. The same impulse drives his current research on faith, vocation, and human flourishing. His recent book, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Christians, Finding Authentic Faith in a Forgotten Age with C.S. Lewis, was published by Brazos 2016. And it turns to medieval faith for guidance on living well today in our natural, social, and cultural worlds. Chris has numerous blogs, but above all, he's the senior editor of our magazine, Christian History. Again, write to us, and we have 30 free copies that we will send to you. And so now, let's go over and join the interview with Chris Armstrong. Good morning. This is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to the Sunday Forum on this Sunday, February the 21st. I'm glad that you could join us in our series here at Emmanuel Lutheran Church on faith, work, and economics. And we're so pleased to have Professor Chris Armstrong with us today. He's a friend and an expert in this area, not just in his own writing, but he's had projects, initiatives that he's led. He's written on the subject, and as importantly, working with the Kern Family Foundation, he has a view of what's going on all across the country in conversations in academic circles and in congregations about faith, vocation, and economics, or faith, work, and economics. We'll have to agree on how we're going to talk about those three subjects. But Chris, first of all, I want to welcome you. It's good seeing you. And I can't wait to hear some of your insights and share them with our people at Emmanuel Lutheran Church. But before we enter into the subject, Chris, why don't you introduce yourself to the people here at Emmanuel?
Sure, and it's always good to see you. We've had many long conversations over the years at venues stretching from Minnesota to Michigan and other places in between, including in Naples, which I wish I was there now, because if you could look out my window here in Waukesha, Wisconsin, you'd see a whole lot of snow. Well, I'm an American-born dual citizen. I grew up in Canada, to be exact, in and around Halifax, Nova Scotia, on the east coast of Canada. You get bonus points if you know where that is. I grew up in a liberal Protestant home with a theologian father and Christian educator mother, who was later ordained. So I suppose you could say I've kind of taken over the family business. But when I emerged from college, I had a religious studies degree. That's where my questions were. When I started that, I was not yet a Christian, but I had questions in that area. I, out of college, went into business for 8 years, essentially marketing, communications, and PR. And I had a sense that I might have an academic vocation, but the road often, at that point, seemed blocked. I applied to grad schools. I wasn't getting scholarship offers, wasn't making it feasible. And by the time, there were other reasons why I didn't make that jump. I was married in my graduating summer, 1986, to my wonderful wife, Sharon. We had before we left for my master's 8 years later in church history at Gordon Conwell Seminary in Boston, we had our first 3 children. girl, boy, girl. And by the time I completed my PhD in American church history, I was specializing in the 19th century American holiness movement. That was 2003. God had added another girl and another boy. So we had a pretty full house. And by the way, today, 3 of those kids are still living with us in our new home in Wisconsin. And that's a wonderful thing, especially because my oldest son is a tremendously good cook. So we do enjoy that. We did come, as you mentioned, to Wisconsin at the invitation of the Kern Family Foundation, whom I've been working with as a team member since 2019, much longer than that as a grantee. I will say a little bit more about them perhaps a bit later in our conversation. Other than that, my wife and I are both were early readers, library rats as kids. The same is true of our own children. So as you can imagine, our house is stuffed with books. And I have to brag, this is a father moment. You can edit this out if you want to. But my middle daughter, Grace, just out of college, just landed a well-paying job, much better than I ever got just out of college in Boston at the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority as a copywriter. Surprising nobody, but making this geek family very proud. So,
well, it's great to hear those. It's great to hear those details, Chris. The Kern Family Foundation, as we know here at Emmanuel, has been very supportive of us. Yes. They've given us a grant with our 5-year program with Emmanuel Academies. And actually, Chris, this series began as an initiative supported by the Kern Family Foundation. So we want to say thank you, and that we hope that you'll pass along, again, our appreciation and our gratitude to the foundation.
It's an honor to be working with them.
We're glad that you're there. This topic of faith, vocation, economics, the Kerns have done a lot to promote that in the United States. But when did you become first acquainted with this topic? Because I think when I was at Luther Seminary and you were at Bethel, you were already working in this area to some degree. Is that correct?
Yeah, I kind of slid into this, as often happens in our vocational lives. There wasn't a distinct moment where I said, I'm going to make this a significant part of my life work. But I think actually there were 2 impressions I got in my very early church experience as a young adult convert in an evangelical setting. I was about 22, and my mid-20s. The first was an impression of a lack of depth historically. Where was the continuity between the church today and the church in other ages, right back to the earliest church? And the second was a strong sense that in these churches, the spiritual was being disconnected from the material. The social aspects, the material aspects of people's everyday experience were not really being addressed within the church. So that one got the impression that all the important stuff for the kingdom was happening inside the church. And so the first impression eventually made me a church historian. The second led me into faith, work, and economics conversations. And what is now 10 years so far of work with the Kern Family Foundation. First, when you met me as a grantee at Bethel Seminary in St. Paul, where I taught for 9 years, and then at Wheaton College in Illinois, where, as you know, I founded and ran a Kern-supported Institute for Faith and Vocation called Opus for 4.5 years. And finally now, since I was going to say last year, but now it's 2019, 2 years ago, as a team member here at the foundation in Waukesha, Wisconsin.
I think you could probably say, Chris, that during that time, these topics, which we've often avoided, right, in the church, both in the academic institutions as well as in congregations, they've only taken on heightened importance, right? I mean, if we talk about COVID, we have to talk about the economics of the United States, right? People are discussing these issues not just on the macro level or reading it in every newspaper, but also in our homes, around the kitchen tables. What the meaning of work? How do we make it economically? How does that relate to my Christian faith? So tell us, what have you learned over these years, especially as the pressure cooker of the last year and 2 have, I think, heightened the opportunity to talk about how we connect our faith with our work and our economic lives?
Yeah, I think, my direct focus and my job description relates to this conversation, as you know, within theological seminaries and Christian colleges that are doing Christian ministry type training. And so I would say one thing I've observed, you're absolutely right. There has been a general increase in this conversation over the past 10 or 20 years. David Miller from Princeton, in his book God at Work, talks about something really starting in the 80s with people feeling the pressure of downsizing, a sense of dissatisfaction with their own work,
Right.
and Christians sort of saying, why am I a different person at church than I am at work? Shouldn't there be a kind of a seamlessness there? And I think since that time, there certainly has been a growing awareness within largely lay Christian circles initially that this was an area of need, that there has to be this connection point between our faith and our work. Different denominations have different stages of development on this. I could say more about this later, but I have found, especially with relation to the doctrine of vocation, Lutherans to have a head start on a lot of other Protestants. But I do think also that the mission of our seminaries is maturing in this area. And increasingly, I think our seminaries are seeing, and I think COVID, as you say, is only accelerating this, the importance of the institutional church's engagement with the working lives of its people and integrating that theme into their formation of future pastors and theologically informed laity. There's a few schools that have done this for some time. Gordon Conwell, Fuller, and especially Regent College in Vancouver have had this mindset for a long time. You mentioned our current supported accelerated pastoral degree programs across the country. There's over 40 now. And this FWE conversation, as we call it, FWE at the Foundation, Faith, Work, and Economics, includes vocation, includes human flourishing, lots of other things, is a priority for those programs to help pastors equip workers for the mission of God in their workplaces, not only through evangelism and discipleship, which was the older approach, starting in the 80s, but also just as crucially through really an incarnational approach to their work that sees its intrinsic worth and importance and the importance of their faith-informed influence in those spaces that many would describe as very secular. So
I think go ahead, Chris, sorry.
Well, I think it starts with pastors learning to have a simple curiosity about the working lives of their people. There's a good book out of the Made to Flourish network called Discipleship with Monday in Mind. It tells the story of a couple dozen pastors across the country who are leaning into this. It makes the point that it's just hard for a pastor to preach, teach, counsel, and pray for their people fully if they haven't explored and sought to understand, at least in some basic ways, their workplace lives, where they spend so many of their waking hours. Last quote here, this guy I really love. I think he's worth getting to know, certainly in print, in person if you can. My friend Scott Kermode, leadership professor at Fuller Seminary, has a book just came out called Innovative Church, How Leaders and Their Congregations Can Adapt to an Ever-Changing World. Boy, isn't that the truth? And I think COVID wasn't even happening when he wrote that. And he says, the first job of the leader is to listen. And he adds, the Christian minister is to listen with special intentness to what he calls the longings and losses of congregants. And I think so many of those longings and losses, and Scott does too, are tied to their working lives, never more than in this time of pandemic. It's the human condition. So, I also see some themes, we get back into this in a few minutes, about a deeper dive from some of these faculty members in theologically inflected readings in some very significant teachers in their own theological disciplines. N.T. Wright, Leslie Newbegin, Miroslav Volf, who are attending to things close to this, and some Christian philosophers, the late Dallas Willard, James K.A. Smith, Jamie Smith at Calvin, Charles Taylor, that are helping put their theology in a social context that includes the culture creating work of our lay people and our church leaders.
I'm glad you mentioned some of these initiatives because they've had a great impact here at Emmanuel as well on how we want to shape our MDiv students, our pastoral students through Emmanuel Academies. And Chris, I actually was very much influenced by Jack Fortin at Luther Seminary. I'm not sure you remembered him, but he had a whole
you introduced me to him, I think.
He had a whole initiative, and I think one of the most tangible aspects was he encouraged our seminarians, and then of course pastors, to make visits of people at work, because we're used to visiting people at home, right, to get to know the family life. Yeah. But very few pastors, have ever visited someone at work where most of us spend most of our time during the day, right? And so it changes when you read the literature that you lifted up. It's important to have that reference of people's work in mind, which pastors have not always had, right? We've not really often understood the workplace in any sort of dynamic or rich fashion. What 2 or 3 trends do you see in these authors that you lifted up? Maybe it's themes that are emerging. I mean, you already started talking about like the innovative church and how these topics emerge there. But what do you see happening, merging out of the literature and out of the theological training?
Sure. I think, I mean, I can say a lot on this. You're going to probably have to stop me at some point.
Okay. Well, that's why you should come on Monday so you can hear more fully what Chris is going to present tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Okay. All right.
Great. I think I see at least kind of 5 ways that the movement is deepening over the past 5 to 10 years. First, deepening data. Gallup, Barna, other research institutions have been paying increasing attention both to the American workplace and to the intersection between work and faith. And there's this picture emerging of disengaged, disenchanted workers, especially young workers who've sought meaning and alignment of values in their work lives and have often failed to find those. One of the most exciting of these studies is probably the newest one, and it's a Lilly-funded national faith and work study supported at the over $1 million level. So this is serious stuff. The co-investigators are my friend and colleague, Denise Daniels, who is now a professor of chair of entrepreneurship at Wheaton College. She was at Seattle Pacific, and Elaine Eklund at Rice. Thousands of people have been surveyed, many interviewed to gather rich qualitative data. And Doctors Daniels and Eklund are right now processing the resulting data. This is an unprecedented study, and they're beginning to work on a number of related writing projects that will roll out over the next few years. So that's a deepening of data. And you may be able to think of other examples. I see, secondly, a deepening of history. I mentioned David Miller at Princeton, his classic book. I know Jack and Dave Williamson and others in the Twin Cities were reading this and recommending it to me 10, 15 years ago. The book's called God at Work. It's a complete study going right back to the 19th century of the faith and work conversation in America. He's been working for a while now on a revision of that, a second edition, with significant new data and new chapters coming, and they'll be coming in the next year or two, we hope. You are holding in your hands, I think, a copy of what I was going to mention second.
That is the Christian History magazine, which I mentioned I've worked with over the years. It's in the midst right now of a 4-issue series on how the church has fostered human flourishing in crucial sectors of human work and culture creation. So the first 2 issues, which are already out, on science and technology and on church and marketplace. The marketplace issue is the one that Pastor Rick has there.
Let me just
yeah, go ahead. Please
just sort of read the topic here, because it's a Christian history magazine. It's when the church goes to market, how Christians have influenced economic life. And boy, Chris, if we could get some extra copies of these, if anybody at Emmanuel would want them, we would purchase those. And you can contact me to receive one of these in the mail. Again, when the church goes to market, how Christians have influenced economic life. All right.
Shoot me an email. I'd be delighted to do that. And we've already heard of Christian nonprofit, large Christian nonprofit organizations working in international development that have gotten 50, 100 copies for their chief donors. So it's really getting some play, and I'm delighted by that. I think it's a strong issue. The second 2 issues, or the third and fourth issue, are coming out in the next year or two on higher education and civic and political engagement. And if I may, you can find these all at www.christianhistorymagazine.org. And there's a back issues tab at the top. You'll find those 2 issues we mentioned toward the top of the list. Watch this space. Finally, in the sort of historical deepening, I'm working on my next book is going to be called something like Fully Human, A Brief History of Pro-Flourishing Faith. And it's going to make the argument that Christian faith fostered human flourishing in crucial material and social as well as spiritual arenas. So that's going to include Christian developments historically in healthcare, higher education, And we're talking about, the invention of the hospital, the invention of the university, those emerge out of the Christian church in the medieval West. Science, arts, law, commerce, politics, and more.
So Chris, how do you do that without falling into the trap of prosperity gospel? Because I know a lot of our preachers don't want to touch this topic, especially of faith and economics. First of all, they have no expertise. And secondly, they're worried that they're going to fall into the trap of these TV preachers that they've been hearing and been frustrated with for so long.
Yeah.
How do you walk that tightrope?
I think one way to do it is to go into what is a human being and what is human flourishing. And if your view of a human being is a secular materialist view, which is so dominant in our culture today, then of course you're going to think about the blessing and providence of God almost exclusively in terms of these material categories. Fortunately, that's not either the biblical view of what a human being is or the Christian historical traditional view of that. And there have been a group of people working on, as you and I have had a brief discussion of this, on Christian humanism, prominently among them a scholar at Regent College in the Packer Chair of Theology there, just newly appointed, Jens, Jens Zimmerman, with two N's at the end. And they're uncovering this heritage that we have of what they're calling Christian humanism, which means we see human beings as having a divinely ordained end that we're moving towards, which of course engages us as spiritual beings, or engages us as whole persons. And the incarnation is very focal to this. God becomes one of us bodily and socially and culturally. He becomes, a first century Jew in a particular place and time. And he does very material things like healing people and feeding them. So there's not the nervousness that we have because of the abuse of a few pastors and movements that have gone into this prosperity gospel ditch. The scripture doesn't have that, and nor does the early church. So I think that's simply becoming more attached and more grounded into our own traditions and scripture is a pretty thorough way of getting out of that problem.
I'm glad you say that, Chris, because I don't find people here at church, they're anxious to talk about faith and economics or faith and work. This is where they live. This is their language. I think maybe the hesitancy is more on the pastoral side because we're just so worried about the minefields. We want to obviously close down this session of the Sunday Forum with any final thoughts that you might have. And of course, the invitation to join us tomorrow at 10 o'clock for a live Zoom meeting with Mondays at Emmanuel with Chris, where we can ask questions about this topic and about key trends and books and speakers. But any final thoughts that you might have, Chris, that you can leave us with?
Well, fresh in my mind right now from reading Zimmerman is some material from Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life and teaching. And I think this will be maybe a teaser because we can get into this a bit more when we meet in sort of face to face, sort of through a glass darkly, but also face to face. That'd be my definition of a Zoom meeting. Where Germany in Bonhoeffer's time was in a kind of cultural eclipse of older Christian-based humanistic values of human freedom, dignity, responsibility. And Bonhoeffer and other colleagues saw in Nazism a loss of that Christian root of what we might call Enlightenment values at this point. And many called for return to that root. And the root of Enlightenment values, whatever secularists might say, is thoroughgoingly Christian. And it really is, again, this larger topic of what is a human being and how do we flourish? Do we all share a common humanity? Do we share a common universal faculty of reason that is precious and is God-given? Can we affirm and protect human freedom and personhood, human rights, promotion of human emancipation, all of these things? All of those had Christian and, as I say, incarnational roots. Bonhoeffer, especially towards the end of his life, as he approached his martyrdom at the hands of the Nazi regime, wove those incarnationally grounded understandings about human nature and human social responsibility in his thought and writings. And I find that tremendously stimulating and a real potential open door for conversations with Protestants who may know just a little bit about Bonhoeffer. They may know some wrong things from people like Eric Metaxas, I'm afraid to say, but there's a wonderful theological and biblical depth there that can really help our free conversation.
Well, Chris knows that any conversation about Dietrich Bonhoeffer is always going to get me excited. And so I hope it'll get you excited too, so that you can join us tomorrow as we talk live with Chris about how we connect faith with work and our economic lives. Chris, I'm so glad that you could join us for the Sunday Forum. And we look forward for the conversation tomorrow. Again, thanks for joining us this Sunday. Bye-bye now.